Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last in the long series of lectures that I've been given. I'm sure they've appeared long to you, on the changes in the Constitution that we've had over the last few years. And the first one, which I gave nearly 3 years ago now, was called Our Old Constitution. And since then I've been contrasting that with the various changes that have occurred. And today I want to draw the threads together, lectures called The New Constitution, and try and see how the Constitution has changed from what it was 10 years ago and more, and then go on to ask the question of what difference it has actually made to most of our lives in normal, everyday terms. Now, let me first briefly recapitulate what the old Constitution was like. And perhaps this is a bit of a caricature, but I think not too much. First of all, the old Constitution was based largely on convention. It was very informal and pragmatic in style. Broadly speaking, what worked. And its central principle was the sovereignty of Parliament, and that reflected the political fact of the dominance of the executive, the dominance of government over Parliament. Britain was a unitary and centralised state ruled from London. There was no devolution, and the boundaries of the United Kingdom, the geographical boundaries, were taken for granted, and the permanence of the United Kingdom was also taken for granted. No one believed or thought that the United Kingdom might at any stage come to an end. The courts had a limited role in constitutional matters. The judges tended to be deferential towards government and towards members of Parliament, and the rule of law was secured primarily through Parliament and not through the judges. Finally, there was no place for the referendum in the British Constitution. Now, that's going a bit further back, because we had our first and so far only national referendum in 1975. But if you look before then, the referendum was thought to be unconstitutional, because broadly speaking, there was no place for the people in the Constitution, and there was no provision for popular consultation. All decisions were made by Parliament. Now, the new Constitution, I think, is different in almost every single respect. Firstly, a lot of it has now been put down on paper and drawn together. If you want to know what devolution is about, you look at the devolution legislation. If you want to know about human rights, you can look at the Human Rights Act of 1998. If you want to know about Europe, you can look at the European Communities Act and subsequent amendments to it. A great deal is put on paper. But more important than that, although Parliament may still be sovereign, and even that could be questioned because of our membership of the European Union, but although perhaps formally you may say Parliament is still sovereign, in practice it's been very severely qualified. Certainly qualified early on, long before the period we're talking about, in 1973, when we joined the European Union. And the European Union, as we are coming to realise, is not just another international organisation like NATO or the United Nations. It's a legal order which is superior to the British Parliament. Now, of course, if you take the principle of the sovereignty of Parliament seriously, there can be no such legal order superior to the British Parliament. Parliament must be superior. So there's a conflict there, and that conflict hasn't been worked out, really, either in theory or in practice. And there are numerous examples, some of them people don't like, some of them they do, whereby legislation has been adopted by the European Union and Parliament has no option but to accept it as a consequence of our membership. There's one recent example which I think will have very considerable effects upon the United Kingdom, legislation against age discrimination. You can no longer put in an advertisement for a job that you want someone young or someone experienced, and you can no longer put euphemisms like dynamic or so on, which indicate young and so on. And this now has to be worked out by various institutions, how they're going to comply with that. And it may well happen that we as in the United States, come to the conclusion that you cannot retire someone on grounds of age. Many of my older colleagues who retire from my university, they then go to work in America because they can't be retired in America on grounds of age. You can only be retired on grounds of lack of competence, which isn't so easy to show to show that you reach a certain age. Now, maybe we do that here, and that will cost the university a lot of money, stop younger people getting jobs, have all sorts of consequences, which you may think good, you may think bad, but the key point is this legislation was not passed by Parliament here, it was passed by the European Union, and we now have to find some way of complying with it. So whatever the theory, in practice, Parliament is much less sovereign than it was because of Europe. And Parliament is also less sovereign, I suggest, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland because of devolution. Formally, Parliament remains sovereign. It could repeal the Scotland Act tomorrow. It could abolish the Scottish Parliament if it so wished. But we all know it's not going to do that. And in practice, matters of health, education, other domestic affairs are conducted by the Scottish Parliament, and in Wales by the National Assembly, in Northern Ireland by their Assembly, and not by Westminster. And that, again, is a practical limitation upon the sovereignty of Parliament. And furthermore, the Human Rights Act, I think, in practice, limits the sovereignty of Parliament. Formally it doesn't. Parliament could take no notice of the judges, but so far it has always done so. And this means that a lot of things that Parliament would like to do, it can't do because of judicial control. There was a very good example relating to what happened last week, the escape of 3 men who were under control orders. Now, the Home Secretary, John Reid, said he faced a problem because he'd originally taken the view, as the government had, that these people should have much stronger restrictions. The original proposal was they should be detained without being charged, but detained by the executive. And that was ruled out of order by the judges. Then they were discussing 90-day detention before a charge was produced. That was dropped in Parliament, and it was generally felt the judges wouldn't have it. And the control orders themselves have been under criticism from the judges. So ministers say, well, the things we'd like to do against terrorism, the judges are stopping us from doing. Now, you can take what side you like in this argument. You can say the judges are right, we've got to preserve a liberal society, or you can say that the government's right because they're accountable to the people for protecting us from terrorism. But whatever you say, I think you can't get away from the fact that Parliament is no longer sovereign in the sense the government can do what it likes and ignore the judges. So in practice, there is another restriction on the sovereignty of Parliament. And what we've got here, I think, is legislation which, in fact, is really constitutional legislation. Now, under the old constitution, you couldn't have constitutional legislation because Parliament was sovereign, and any act had the same status as any other act. But this legislation I've been talking about, the European Communities Act, the devolution legislation, the Human Rights Act, they, I think, have the status of constitutional statutes in the sense that although they could be repealed in theory in the same way as any other, in practice they have an entrenched status. They are the fundamentals of what might eventually be a written constitution, and I'm going to talk later on about the question of whether we ought to have one. But let's go on to further changes from the original position I mentioned. I mentioned the referendum, and I said we had one national referendum in 1975. Now, since 1997, we've had a number of subnational referendums. We haven't had a national referendum, we've had a number of subnational referendums. We've had referendums in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales on devolution, and they were all successful. We've had a referendum in London on whether there should be a mayor and an authority, and that too was successful. And then in 2004, we had a referendum in the northeast of England on whether they wanted regional devolution. And that was unsuccessful. They said they didn't want it, thank you very much. And so that ended that particular proposal. Now, we haven't, as I said, had any other national referendums, but all sorts of referendums have been promised. And I've got a list here of 6 referendums that have been promised at various stages, and I'll read them out to you. First, we won't be joining the euro without a referendum. And that does show the power of the referendum, because it said Tony Blair would have liked to get us into the euro, but it's difficult for him if he has to have a referendum, because there hasn't been one single opinion poll that has shown a majority in Britain for entering the euro. Now, you may say before 1997, governments would have ignored that. They'd say, well, we think it's right to join the euro, we should join, and no doubt people would judge us afterwards in a general election. But neither Blair nor Gordon Brown or anyone else can join, because they have to have a referendum first, and that restricts, it's again a further restriction on the right of Parliament, in form of entrenchment, if you like, preventing Parliament from doing, or the government from doing, what it says it would like to do. The second referendum promised, again on Europe, no accident, I think, so many of them to do with Europe, that the constitutional treaty, if it's resurrected, will not be ratified unless there's a referendum. Now, the government at present is trying to slightly get out of that, because it may be that the original treaty won't be resurrected, but there'll be a mini-treaty containing some of the items, and then there's a big argument over whether that should require a referendum or not, and the government's saying it shouldn't, but you can be sure there are lots of people who will say, look, you're trying to weasel out of this, and we're jolly well not going to sign up to any constitutional change in Europe without a further referendum. So that's a second area, the question of a treaty for Europe. Then the third area is changing the electoral system, possibly to one of proportional representation in Westminster. Now, Blair promised in 1997 that there would be a referendum on the electoral system after a commission had been set up. And a commission was set up by Roy Jenkins, which produced various proposals, but there hasn't been a referendum. So, in a way, this was a promise, but a politician's promise, if you see what I mean. It hasn't yet been carried out. But I think it's fair to say that nevertheless, we wouldn't change, no government would contemplate changing the electoral system for Westminster without the use of a referendum. It would probably now be thought to be wrong. Now, the fourth referendum, and these are referendums we have had in local government, that not only in London, but any other area which wants a directly elected mayor has to have a referendum before it can do that. And various authorities have, and I think about in 12 they've succeeded. In Oxford, where I live, it failed. But in other areas, it succeeded. I think Watford has one, I think Hemel Hempstead has one, but there are various areas which have mayors, very few at the moment, but no local authority can have a mayor, directly elected mayor, without a referendum. That's the London principle as well, of course. That's the fourth one. Then a referendum is required before Northern Ireland can be separated from the rest of the United Kingdom. That too cannot be done. A majority in Northern Ireland, if the Assembly, if the elections produced a majority, say under Sinn Féin, that said we don't want to be in the United Kingdom anymore, that wouldn't be enough. There has to be a referendum in Northern Ireland. And sixthly, it's a new provision. It's rather obscure and probably hasn't been noticed by many people, and no reason why it should. This relates to Wales. Now, Wales, those who attended my lecture on devolution may or may not remember, but Wales doesn't have the same form of devolution as Scotland. It doesn't have power over primary legislation, over statutes, but only over secondary legislation, that is, orders of government, statutory instruments and the like. Some people in Wales who want it to have the same powers as Scotland, and some people who don't. But the government passed legislation last year, a new Government of Wales Act, saying that Wales couldn't have primary legislative powers without a referendum in Wales. So that's yet another proposal for a referendum. I make that 6. I hope my arithmetic's right. There's 6 different proposals. So obviously, the referendum has become an important instrument in Britain, and no one can say any more that it's unconstitutional and somehow anti-British. Now, it follows from all this as well that the centrality of Parliament in British life is much less than it was, because there's been a transfer of powers both upwards to Europe and also downwards to these various devolved bodies. A sharing of power, sharing of sovereignty, if you like, and not only within the country, but in Northern Ireland, as those who remember my last lecture will remember, a sharing of power with the Irish Republic. The Irish Republic has a certain role in the government of Northern Ireland, so it's sharing with a government outside the United Kingdom government. Very remarkable situation. And you may say that for the non-English parts of the United Kingdom, Westminster is now in effect a federal parliament, because the domestic matters are now dealt with outside. And all this relates, I think, to a further point that follows on from it, I think, that being British, something on which Gordon Brown has spoken very eloquently, being British means something different from what it meant 10 years ago. And I think 10 years ago, most of us, if asked of being British, would say it means belonging to the British nation, which is a single nation. But now, it seems, that being British is belonging to a multinational state comprising not one nation, but 4 or 3.5 nations, however you call the Northern Irish, but the Scottish, the English, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish, or the Unionists in Northern Ireland, or whatever. But at least there's more than one nation now in Britain. We don't see ourselves as a single nation, but a multinational country. And part of the problem of government is to ensure these various nations live in harmony together. That wasn't a problem, say, 50 years ago. No one thought about it much, about whether people English, Scottish or Welsh and so on, or how much money Scotland got from the Treasury or Wales. But we now do think of that. And it's a union which seems subject to continual renegotiation. Already Wales, the position of Wales was altered a bit with the Government of Wales Act last year. The Scots, especially under the new nationalist administration, will be asking for more powers from Westminster, and the Liberals in Scotland also think that Scotland ought to have more powers. Some people think Scotland should have the power to raise its own revenue. So it's all in the air a bit. And at the time of devolution, the Welsh Secretary, Ron Davies, said that devolution was not an event but a process, a continual process of renegotiation. And that certainly seems to be the case. And so Britishness, in a sense, now seems to be a kind of conversation, a permanent conversation between the English, the Scots, the Welsh and the Northern Irish on matters which it's difficult to settle definitively. Moreover, and I think this one I'm bound to say this, that you can't take the continued existence of the United Kingdom for granted in a way which could have been done, say, 15 years ago. It's possible, not probable, perhaps it's possible, that Scotland will at some future stage become independent. I think that can't be excluded. So the future of the United Kingdom, far from being a certainty, is now, as it were, a question mark. And one possibility, which I say is being discussed, and some people in England welcome it. They say, well, we'd be actually better off without the Scots. They should go, and good luck to them, and so on. And some people in Scotland think that too. There are sizable proportions who favour Scottish independence on both sides of the border. And that also is new. Now, furthermore, in Parliament itself, the very centre of government, Westminster, Parliament has changed in a way, I think, the opposite to that is noted, that's suggested by most people, because most people think Parliament is a rather docile body, sort of Blair's poodles and so on. But actually, Parliament, which had been fairly docile in the past, in a sense began to find itself has begun to find itself in the last few years. And dissent, MPs voting against their party line, is now much greater than it has ever been. And if you look at the last Parliament from 2001 to 5, the revolts on the Iraq War and Foundation hospitals were the largest revolts since the Corn Laws in 1846. And even in this Parliament, the government has been defeated 4 times already on its legislation, and that's a greater number of times than any government with a secure majority since the war. MPs are, in one sense of the word, revolting more than they were in the past, contrary to the image of very docile members of Parliament. And the House of Lords also, which tended to be fairly docile, at least when Conservative governments were in office, it had a permanent Conservative majority. Since the hereditary peers were removed in 1999, the House of Lords has also become much more assertive and more professional, and particularly on civil liberties matters. It has rejected many things done by the Labour government. And this isn't because there was a Conservative majority in the Lords, there isn't. And the convention now seems to be accepted, this is something again very new, that no single party should ever have an overall majority in the Lords. The largest party now in the Lords, for the first time in its history, is the Labour Party. The second largest group is a crossbench group. The Conservatives now third, and the Liberals fourth. And in practice, most legislation produced by the government, to get it through, you need support from the crossbenchers and or the Liberals to get it through. So it's now not as easy as it was to get things through the House of Lords. Now, a further change from 10 years ago is a tremendous diversity of electoral systems in this country. And if you read about the Scottish elections, you will have read about the confusion which people had because they had two different systems of proportional representation in use. One, the single transferable vote system for the Scottish local government authorities, and one which is the German additional member system for the Scottish Parliament. Now, I'm not, please don't ask me to explain these two different systems again. I did when I gave my lecture on electoral systems, and it should be still on the website. But these are two different systems. But the point I want to stress is that I think if you said 15 years ago we'd be using all these different systems, you'd be thought to be slightly out of touch with reality. People said the basic British system is first past the post, and anything else is rather cranky and used by foreigners, and we don't want to experiment with that here. Well, now we've got, I think, no less than 4 different electoral systems used together with first past the post in Britain. We've got the single transferable vote, which is used for most elections in Northern Ireland and for Scottish local government. We've got the supplementary vote, which is used for London, the London Authority, which people here who live in London voted for it, which will have used themselves. I beg your pardon, for the London Mayor, I beg your pardon, the supplementary vote for the London Mayor. You've got the additional member system, the German system, which is used for London Authority and also for the Scottish and Welsh devolved bodies. And you've got the regional list system of proportional representation, which is used for European elections. And as I say, I'm not going to describe these again, but they're on the website for those who are interested. And a voter in London uses 4 different electoral systems. Let me go through them again. One for the House of Commons, which is first past the post. Another for the European elections, a regional list system of PR. A third for the London Authority, which is the German or the additional member system of PR. And a fourth for the London Mayor, the supplementary vote. And the 5th one comes in Scottish local government and Ireland, Northern Ireland, which is a single transferable vote. So 5 different systems. And as I say, 50 years ago, certainly proportional representation was regarded as something a bit cranky. And now used for all elections in Britain, except elections of the House of Commons and elections to local government outside Scotland and Northern Ireland, that is in England and Wales. And Wales is thinking of changing their local government system. So you may think, you may be pleased or displeased about it, that proportional representation is a bit like the tide coming in. Difficult to hold it out. Once you start in one place, it gets into another place as well, and it's difficult to keep out. And the last redoubts are really English local authorities and Westminster. And you may say it's, some might say it's an inevitable tide sweeping in. Others may say, no, we've got to push it back. It's no good. But anyway, that's an important change. And of course, following from that, we've seen other changes, namely new experiences of coalition and minority government in Scotland and Wales. We've had, since the Scottish Parliament was set up, it's been governed until this year by a coalition between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. It's now being governed by a minority government comprising the SNP and the Greens. Wales has been governed by a majority, Labour majority, a Labour-Liberal coalition, and now a minority Labour government, which may at any time be overthrown by a rainbow coalition of Plaid Cymru, the Liberals and the Conservatives. So these are new political arrangements, very unfamiliar at Westminster. We haven't seen a coalition since the war, minority government, very rare. And one interesting question to ask is, will all this have any consequences to getting coalitions in non-English parts of the country? And furthermore, as a result of proportional representation, voters are more willing to support minority parties than they were. We used to think we were a strongly two-party system. In the last election, even for Westminster, just 69% of those who voted Labour or Conservative, the lowest proportion by far since the war. But people aren't just voting for Liberal Democrats, they're also voting for the Greens, they're voting for UKIP, which in the European elections gained 17% of the vote in 2004, and they're voting for the BNP, which gained over 4% in the European elections in 2004, those elections conducted by proportional representation. And people's views on PR tend sometimes to differ, according to who they think it'll benefit. If you say it'll benefit the Liberals, oh, they're good people, a good idea. If you then say it might benefit extremists like the BNP, say, oh, well, we don't want that. But you can't have both. But the interesting question is whether this habit will be transferred into a greater willingness to vote for minority parties at Westminster. And obviously there's no answer to that question. All I can say is let's wait and see. We don't know, but it's a possibility. Now, finally, judges have a much greater role in politics than they do. And it's not enough now for governments to say we can get our policies past the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They have to ask, can we also get them past the judges? Judges are now making decisions which politicians used to make on the balance of civil liberties and protection of society. And that obviously upsets the politicians because they say, we're accountable to the public on these matters, and if there's a terrorist attack, people will blame us. They won't blame the judges. They'll say, why didn't you protect the country? But our hands are bound because of human rights legislation. So there's a new conflict there. Now, to summarise these points, in general, I think, and contrary to many public perceptions, there are many more checks on government than there were. You've got devolution, you've got the judges, you've got rebellious MPs, you've got the House of Lords, you've got us, the people, through the use of the referendum. So I think this, if one wants to summarise the major changes in one, as it were, sentence, I think would be that the government is much more trammelled, much less untrammelled than it was 10, 15 years ago, constitutionally checked. And that, in a way, is what you mean by a constitution, that there are great checks on the power of government, say in the American Constitution, for example. But it's fair to say that the central parts of government, the government machine, have been comparatively untouched by constitutional reform. There's been no reform of the electoral system for Westminster. There's been no reform of the cabinet system, party system, some reforms in the Commons, but perhaps not as fundamental as some of the other reforms. So if you like, the core of the British system, what you might call the Westminster model, remains untouched. But you may say, with a lot of this having been written down, a lot of this constitutional legislation, or would be called constitution in many other countries, devolution, Human Rights Act, all the rest of it, isn't it time we had a constitution ourselves? And the case for it, or not the case rather, but statements of this kind have been made by Gordon Brown recently said, and the Attorney General said they want to debate, which is a kind of politician's term, they want to debate on whether we should have a constitution. And you may say so much of it's now been written down, why don't we write the whole of it down? Now, when people ask this question, they say, well, should Britain have a constitution? But really this isn't the question to be asked, I think. The question to be asked is, why shouldn't Britain have a constitution? What is different about Britain from every other democracy almost that has a constitution? Now, there are only three democracies that don't have constitutions. Ourselves, New Zealand, which has a roughly similar principle of parliamentary sovereignty, and Israel and the Israelis, because they can't agree, firstly, on their boundaries of the state, and secondly, on the role of religion. They're working towards a constitution with a series of basic laws, but they haven't yet got there. They think they ought to have one, but they can't agree on what it should be. New Zealand, I don't think, is preparing a constitution. But all the other democracies in the world, which are a large number, have constitutions. Now, why haven't we got a constitution? And I think all this should come out from the lectures, in particular the first one that I gave. And the first reason is historical, that we've never had what might be called a constitutional moment. That is a moment when we began as a state, in the way that, for example, America began when she broke off from Britain, or the colonies, Australia, Canada and so on, had when they broke off from British rule, or Germany after the war when they had to start again after Nazism, or the French when de Gaulle came to power in 1958, they began again with a new system. The French have often begun again, actually. They've begun again 16 times since the French Revolution. They've had 16 constitutions. There used to be a story that someone went into a shop to ask for a copy of the French Constitution, and the reply was, we don't sell periodicals here. Their present system which has now lasted almost 50 years, is the second longest lasting since the Revolution. And during the Fourth Republic, which preceded it, there used to be an advertisement in the Paris metro: "Republics come and go, Sude paint lasts." So they've started a number of times. But we haven't started at all. We've evolved, and we had a break. The only time we had a break, really, in the Civil War in the 17th century. Then we had a constitution, 1653, Cromwell's instrument of government. But Cromwell abolished the House of Lords, and then shortly afterwards he abolished the House of Commons and became a dictator. So we didn't think the experience of constitution was necessarily good. And in 1660, when we had the monarchy, we called it the Restoration. We'd gone back to where we were before, and since then we've evolved without ever having begun. Now that's a historical reason, but there's also a conceptual reason, namely the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, because if Parliament's supreme, there's no point having a constitution, because Parliament can always trump it. There can't be something that checks Parliament. Now, I think I suggested that Parliament is no longer in practice sovereign, so that argument, in my view, no longer holds as to why we shouldn't have one. And as I said, we've already codified so much of the Constitution, there seems no reason why we shouldn't codify the rest. And we might now be in a position to consider what the principles of our Constitution should be. But I think there's an argument against producing it now. And before saying why, I should say that I actually took part with some students last term in trying to draw up a British Constitution, a constitution as it is, not as it ought to be. And if anyone's interested in the result, it's published in a book published by the Smith Institute called Towards a New Constitutional Settlement, edited by Chris Bryant, MP. And you can get it from the Smith Institute. They published the Constitution as an appendix with the names of heroic students who did the work. So it can be done. But I think it isn't a good time now, probably, for the very reason that I think constitutional reform, like devolution, is a process and not an event, and we're only halfway down the road. I think I began by saying that in my first lecture, we've been doing something rather unique in the democratic world. We've been converting an unwritten constitution to a written one in a piecemeal and ad hoc way, rather than at a single stroke in one go, as in the case of most other democracies. And there are, I think, two reasons for this. Firstly, there's no real agreement on what the final resting place should be. No consensus. For example, what about House of Lords reform? What's that likely to be at the end? Can anyone envisage what that'll be in future? What about the state of devolution? What about our relations with Europe, the electoral systems, and all sorts of things are, as it were, halfway. We're living in a kind of halfway house at the moment. And so that's the first reason. There's no real consensus on what the final resting place should be. And the second reason is, sadly, certainly for the sale of my book, so not for these lectures, because you've come very generously, but I think there's very little public interest in the Constitution. I think if you ever canvass a political party, you don't find people saying at the doorstep, what we need really is a Constitution, and I'll support any party that does that, or the real priority for this country is constitutional reform. People don't say that. And I think this raises an important point with which I want to conclude these lectures, and it's trying to answer the question of why it is that this whole process of constitutional reform which I've described, and which seems to me very, very radical, has made so little difference to most people. And if you imagine, well, you don't have to imagine most people here in this room are living in England. Let's imagine, again, I think it's probably true, you don't want devolution, you're not particularly interested in having devolution in the southeast or wherever you come from. And although you may think the Human Rights Act's a good piece of legislation, you hope never to have to use it. The last thing you want is to fall into the hands of the lawyers. And so you think, no doubt, a good thing to have it on the statute book, perhaps, but really doesn't actually make much impact on my own life at all. And so you may say, well, all this has made no difference to me. And I think on the whole you'd be right. Because what the constitutional reform agenda has done is to redistribute power between people professionally involved in politics and the law. It's redistributed power away from politicians at Westminster to politicians in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and London, and also to the judges. And you may say, well, what it's doing is telling us how the officer class is dividing up the spoils, how the elite can run things. But you may say, well, we're not actually members of the elite, we're not in government, and we don't necessarily want to be in government, most people don't, and therefore this doesn't actually help us much. You may say, well, that there are more checks on government, true. Parliament may be stronger, we've got the judges may be stronger, it enables us to check power more easily, and I think that's a fair point. Power is more easily controlled now than it was 15 years ago. But they don't give us a greater share of the power for ourselves. In other words, there's not been a redistribution of power from the politicians to, if you like, the people or the electorate. It's a redistribution of power amongst the politicians themselves. And you may say this is one of the reasons for the frequently noted phenomenon of disenchantment with political parties. And I think some of you may remember when I spoke about the finance of political parties, I said that fewer of us joined political parties than did 50 years ago. The Labour Party now has under 200,000 members, and the Conservatives around 250,000. Now, 50 years ago, Labour had 1 million individual members, and the Conservatives around 1.5 million. Or if you put the point another way, 50 years ago, 1 in 11 of us belonged to a political party. Now just 1 in 88 do. It's a very different point. Or you can put the point another way. Bodies like the National Trust, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, they've got over 1 million members each, more than all the parties put together. And this shows an interesting point that there is a sense of civic spirit in Britain. People are willing to join organisations and support things. They're not entirely apathetic, but they're not willing to join the political parties. And also people are much less attached to the party of their choice than they used to be. Now, this point, and there's been a lot of breast-beating in Britain about it, it's not peculiar to Britain, it's true of most, if not all, democracies, that people are much less willing to join political parties than they were in the past. And this is true whatever the constitutional setup of a country. Some people say, if we had proportional representation, this would all change. People then join parties and suddenly come out to vote. Some people say, well, if we had a federal system of government, more decentralisation, that would all change. People would be more enthused and so on. But countries with those systems, they have exactly the same problems as Britain. It's not a problem of a particular constitutional structure. It's somehow an endemic problem of modern democracies. And I think that the constitutional reform agenda hasn't dealt with it. And I think because it hasn't tackled the basis of the problem, which is that people no longer feel that political parties are, as they once were, agents of change. And this was said, interestingly enough, by Gordon Brown a long time ago when he was in opposition in 1992. He said in the past, people used to join the Labour Party because they saw the Labour Party as an agent of change. But he said now people want to be agents of change themselves. In other words, they don't look to political parties, they believe that they themselves might be agents of change. And one of the reasons for this is that the era of what you might call tribal politics has gone. And by tribal politics, I mean that when people used to say, we've always voted Labour, or my father's Conservative and so I'm a Conservative. And I think 50 years ago one would have heard a lot of that, but I think one doesn't hear it now. People don't now say we've always been Conservative or we're all Labour here. And this is again one reason why support for the two major parties I think has gone down. And the political agenda has shifted from what political scientists call position politics to what they call valence politics. Now, position politics is where the parties disagree about fundamentals. So 50 years ago, people disagreed about whether basic industries should be nationalised, about whether we should have nuclear weapons or not, about whether we should keep the colonies or not. There was fundamental disagreement. Now the disagreement is about what political scientists call valence issues, and the valence issue is an issue where we all agree about the ends, but we disagree about the means. Now, we all agree, for example, that there should be a national health service. What we disagree about is which party is most efficient at managing it, at running it. We all broadly agree, within broad limits, that there should be a comprehensive system. I mean, David Cameron made that clear the last week, at some cost to himself, perhaps. But there's broad agreement that the comprehensives will stay, but that they need to be supplemented by other sorts of schools. A rough consensus, but we disagree, perhaps, about which party is best able to secure better schools. And part of Tony Blair's skill as a politician is to convert position issues into valence issues, because most of the position issues on which the Labour Party was hooked were rather unpopular with the public. More taxation, more public expenditure, more nationalisation. People didn't like those sorts of things. So what Blair's saying is we all agree that there ought to be a mix of public and private in the public services, and the question is really about who does it most efficiently, and I think the Labour Party does. And the only way to argue with him is to take an extreme position on the extreme left and say, well, it should be only a public, or an extreme position on the extreme right to say it should be just the market. And if you take those positions, you're going to lose elections, probably. So this is why Blair is so difficult to beat. He got that from Clinton. It's called the technique of triangulation. You take two extreme positions and put yourself in the middle, so you can only be attacked from an extreme and unpopular position. It's a great political skill on his part, I think, and Cameron's trying to do the same. So politics is less based on ideology, it's less tribal, but therefore also, in a sense, duller. You can't go to the barricades on behalf of foundation hospitals or city academies. These are issues you can argue about, but they're not really, you're not going to carry a flag about them. So the difference between parties are less about ends than about means, and you don't anymore hear the slogans, socialism now or set the people free. So the grip of the parties is less because of that. And it's for that reason, I think, that people tend to be disillusioned with political parties. It's not wholly the fault of the parties, I think. Peter Hain said in 2003, as leader of the House of Commons, he said, "We who constitute the political class conduct politics in a way that turns off our voters, readers, listeners and viewers. Too many people believe that government is something done to them. Westminster must stop giving the impression of being a private club and instead give the public a greater sense of ownership." And therefore, it's that greater sense of ownership that I think is perhaps the next step in constitutional reform, and which needs to be done. And in my personal opinion, that involves a much greater degree of direct democracy. I mean, referendums are a beginning, but we only have referendums on subjects that governments think we ought to be able to decide on. What about other issues we want to decide on? Now, governments have said, the present government said, there can be local referendums on whether people want to abolish grammar schools, not whether you want to have new ones, but whether you want to abolish existing ones. But you may say, why only on that issue? Why not, for example, the structure of the National Health Service in your area, or the size of a local authority budget? Why not have popular participation on issues of that kind? Why is it only certain issues on which voters can be trusted to decide? So, in my opinion, the constitutional reform agenda, if it's going to make an impact on ordinary citizens, will have to supplement the sorts of reforms I've been mentioning, which on the whole affect only the elite, with reforms which affect the people as a whole. And I think that is the next step forward, because I think the machinery of democracy needs to be improved by involving more people in political decisions. Now, I think probably most people here will agree with that, but there's one danger about that which I want to draw your attention to and then conclude. I don't know how to answer it, but the danger is this, that the sorts of people who benefit from it are people like ourselves. That's a terrible danger. And the reason it's a terrible danger is because we, by definition, are already the articulate who take an interest in politics. And we are, by definition, because we take an interest in politics, a minority. And therefore it will give us, who already have a lot of influence and political resources because we're articulate, already greater power and influence we have, and the large majority who don't perhaps take as much interest will not have so much influence. Oscar Wilde very famously said in the 19th century that the main problem with socialism was that it took up too many evenings. And what he meant was that it's only a small minority who are going to actually take the trouble and time to participate in politics. And this, I think, is one of the problems that we need to deal with this new dispensation. Nevertheless, I think this is going to be the way forward. And I think if I'm going to summarise my conclusion, it would be this, that the constitutional forms and structure that we've inherited are still, despite the reforms of the last 10 years and beyond, they're still broadly a top-down system and no longer in alignment with the real political and popular forces of the age. And I think the real problem that we're going to face in the future is to make these constitutional forms congruent with the new political forces of the desire of the public, or at least many members of the public, to make decisions for themselves rather than to have them left to be made by the politicians. Well, that's the end of a long journey, and before we finish, there's a little time, less than usual, because I've talked perhaps longer than usual, for a few questions from those who'd like to give them. Thank you. Right, a lady here. Yes.
Could I ask, is there any limitation on the mayor's... thank you. Is there any limitation on the mayor's powers? Because he seems able to do what he likes with traffic through TfL, without any consideration for democracy.
Yes, you're talking about the Mayor of London,
yeah,
who has different powers from others. Well, actually, despite what seems to be the case, the Mayor of London has very limited powers except in transport, and the legislation was drawn up very much with the fear that Ken Livingstone might get it. And even on transport, he's limited because the government established the PPP for London Transport before Livingstone became mayor, and he wasn't allowed to alter it, even though you may say he ought to have powers over the underground. He's inherited a system he doesn't approve of. Now, the main power he's got is over congestion charging, and I think he was given that power because it was thought he would make him unpopular, raising a tax and so on. And on that, on those powers and so on, there aren't. That's a very small area comparatively. The only power is to remove him next time. The authority doesn't have much power over him. But on a lot of the things people are worried about, you see, Livingstone says, people often come up to me and say, why aren't you doing about crime in London or bad education in London or unemployment? He's got no powers over those matters. And people, I think, he hasn't got the power, for example, that Giuliani had as mayor of New York. The limited powers, but perhaps concentrate in a certain area, which, if you like, may make him unpopular.
but he has unreasonable powers through TfL in that they can have an enormous subsidy and not use the money, our money, efficiently.
Well, they can't raise any money of their own. They can only get a precept on the boroughs, and they get money from the centre, which can always cut off them, and he can't raise any taxes. The only tax he can raise is the congestion charge.
I see. Yes.
Gentleman here? No. Okay.
You mentioned about your book sales, which is most unfortunate, but it seems to me that the people who buy your books, being the only ones who care about constitutional matters, but just on a matter of reason, the constitutional matters are most important. For example, whether we're in Europe or the powers that the House of Lords have got seem to me to be far more important than how we spend our money in a particular year on education and hospitals, because these are for the long term. And people don't seem to, as you say, appreciate that because they're not very interested in these issues. So I just wonder about your business about involving people. It really gets down to what you think of people's intelligence, or the Oscar Wilde statement about the time they're prepared to make available to consider these matters. And I just wonder whether your idea of local direct democracy will founder on that point, and if we would not be better off trying to develop representative democracy, which to me seems an utter farce now. There's no arguments ever developed on television, there's no proper debate, no one knows, or hardly anyone knows, the name of their Member of Parliament. Candidates don't appear before the electorate and address them. And it just seems to me that that's another possibility that I'd like to hear your opinion on. Is it possible to say representative democracy?
I think opinion is more educated than it was. I've just been reading a book on the immediate post-war period, 1945 to 51, and a survey there showed that 49% of the public could not name a single British colony. And a survey was carried out in Greenwich at the time of the 1950 general election, and about half did not know which party the local MP belonged to. Parties then weren't put on ballot papers. So I think education is gradually increasing. I think you can get round the point about people not being interested by saying that a referendum or local referendum should require a minimum turnout for the result to be effective. And if people want to decide enough of them should vote, you shouldn't have just a small percentage. But obviously, there's no contradiction to improving representative democracy as well. And even in Switzerland, which goes furthest along the road to direct democracy, it's not a pure direct system. You might call it semi-representative, but people still vote for MPs in Parliament, and there's still a representative government. So no one proposes we go entirely, if you like, all the way in the Greek direction. It's a question of degree and not of one or the other, I think. But obviously, this should go along with improving representative politics as well. But my point was that people don't believe in parties in the same way as they once did. They don't say, I want change, therefore I'll vote Labour or Liberal or Conservative. They say, I want change, therefore I'll try and go to a meeting locally and get change or get it done myself. People, see, in their economic lives, people are now much more sovereign than they were. The role of the consumers changed. There are now more shareholders in Britain than there are trade unionists. In the public services, people now demand better services. We now have these notices telling when the next tube train is coming, how if our train's late, we can get compensation, and so on and so on. And people aren't prepared to be passive in those areas of life, so they're not prepared to be passive in politics either and simply accept what the parties or government say is good for them. Gentleman here at the front. Sorry, you'll be next, I promise.
I was very interested in what you said about Switzerland, because I've always had a great admiration for the Swiss system of referenda at various levels. But the point that I don't think's come out, and probably could never come out in a constitution, is the role of whipping in UK politics. It seems to be almost a uniquely British thing. I've 3 times in my life been approached to stand for local government. Every time I've said, fine. On the whole, I agree with the party, but on various things, I shall not accept a whip if I think it's a stupid idea. I've never gone any further with it. I've been dropped.
Well, I think the whipping system depends on consent, and if enough people rebel, as on Foundation Hospital or the Iraq War, there's nothing the whips can do. The argument for it is simply the party goes to the country on a certain set of policies, and therefore has to offer some sort of guarantee to the public it will carry them out. And therefore the presumption is most people who stand for that party agree with its policies. Now, I accept what you say, that in the past it was carried too far. In Parliament, and I don't know about local government, in Parliament that's much less so now. There's much more rebellion now than there was. Yes, this gentleman trying to get in.
If I could make 3 quick points. First of all, here's the European Constitution, signed by Tony Blair. If anybody has trouble sleeping, they can borrow it, and I can tell you. And the point I'd like to make, I mean, everybody seems to me, within the new expanded EU, committed to some kind of constitution. They won't call it that, and I think Tony Blair will sign some document in the next couple of weeks. So I'm not sure that even if we went ahead with a UK or an English constitution, it would have any legs, because we're going down a federal route. The second point, you mentioned that the present government has been defeated 4 times in recent history. Well, I would suggest that this government has passed more legislation than its predecessors, and something like 99% of its legislation has been passed through the House into law. And thirdly, you mentioned public apathy. And people that have a genuine interest in politics are disenchanted and disenfranchised simply because they consider all politicians now as liars. The politics has been reduced to brand management. And if you look at Blair's manifesto from the early 90s and his speeches from the mid-90s, he's done a volte-face on every item, whether it's the nuclear question, EU, public-private partnerships. And so I don't think people, whatever system, will be persuaded to become more active and enthusiastic about politics.
On your first point about the European Constitution, it is true, as I've said, that when we joined the European community, as the European Union was then called, we did join a legal order which is superior to that of Westminster. That is right, and the Constitution might have to reflect that. I rather trailed my coat for the students when we drew our Constitution up, because I said, well, the section on the legislature ought to begin, legislative power lies with Parliament and the European Union. And we can't have that. The Daily Mail would get onto us, and we can't say that. So they called European Union legislation delegated legislation, which is formally true, but misdescribes the system, I think. So that's a perfectly fair point. But of course, that's true of France and Germany and every other country which has a constitution. On the point about politicians being liars, I actually don't believe that. I think that's partly the fault of the media. I think that politicians are the same mixture as the rest of us, I think. Sadly. But I mean, politicians have a problem that often reality turns out differently from what they imagine, and they have to make compromises that they didn't anticipate. But I think on the whole, politicians are equally honourable people as they were. It's worth saying that, this, again, I got from this book on 1945, a survey was done at the time about what people thought of politicians, and the percentage thinking they were untrustworthy and deceitful was almost exactly the same as it is today. Now, we think of people like Churchill and Attlee as giants, but people didn't think like that then. It's a natural, perhaps a healthy tendency to think they're all a set of rogues, but I think they're just the same sort of people as we are, and the same sort of mix. One more question, and then we have to stop, I think. Who's going to get it?
Do you think Gordon Brown will address the West Lothian question?
Well, I think it's a question that is better not posed for this reason. for this reason. The question is to remind people that Scotland can vote, shall we say, the Scottish MPs can vote on matters like foundation hospitals or city academies in England, even though the Scottish Parliament's decided not to accept them in Scotland, and English MPs can't vote on those matters in Scotland. So Scottish MPs can vote on education and health in England, but English MPs can't vote on those matters in Scotland. Now, part of the difficulty is that the money the Scottish Parliament gets is wholly derived from the Treasury in London, and therefore an increase or a decrease in education or health spending in England has an automatic knock-on effect in Scotland. Now, suppose MPs decided to cut expenditure on education in England. That would mean the Scottish Parliament would also have to cut education expenditure in Scotland, even though they might not want to do so. They just would get less money. And therefore, for that reason, it seems to me Scottish MPs need to be represented on matters involving spending in Westminster. Now, I think this argument doesn't apply to matters which don't involve expenditure, like, say, hunting. The banning of hunting doesn't, as far as I can see, involve spending. And on that issue, I think it's reasonable to say that Scots MPs shouldn't be voting, because that's decided by the Scottish Parliament. But the idea that some people are producing, and I think the Conservatives supporting the last manifesto, the idea that only English MPs should vote on English issues is unworkable for this reason, that you then have two governments. You'd have a different majority in the United Kingdom, a different majority in England. So you'd have what was presumably a Labour majority in the United Kingdom on matters of foreign policy and defence, but a Conservative majority in England on education and health. So the government would have to swap over the opposition benches every time you change the issue. And indeed, sometimes on bills, because some bills apply one part to the whole United Kingdom and other bits just to England. So I think that's unworkable. And I think the way to look at the West Lothian question is this, that an agreement was made with devolution that Scotland would get certain benefits, if you like, to keep Scotland within the United Kingdom. The argument was it was a good idea to keep Scotland within the United Kingdom. And on the whole, English MPs took little interest in Scottish legislation anyway, and therefore that wasn't a great deprivation. And the Union rests on restraint by the largest body in it, which is the English. Now, there's a lot of talk about how we're ruled by the Scots and so on, but after all, the English are the largest group in the United Kingdom. About 85% of the people in the United Kingdom are English. About 85% of the constituencies are English. So if anything the English want, they can easily get. They're the largest unit. Now, if England sort of strengthens its muscles and starts getting nationalistic and strong, the country will break up, because the Scots and Welsh and Northern Irish demand a certain degree of autonomy, even though they're in a permanent minority. And so the Union rests on a very delicate, if you like, contract between a very powerful majority, the English, and these other non-English groupings. And if you think the United Kingdom's worth preserving, that is a price you have to pay. Now, some people think it isn't. Some people say it should go, and people from all parts of the political spectrum say it should break up, and that's obviously a political argument. But I think if you want to hold it together, that's the argument. And on that apocalyptic note, I will end. But those who want more punishment, I'm giving a series of lectures on American presidents from Roosevelt to the present day next year, which will be in the Gresham programme. I hope some of you will come along to that. It'd be very nice to see the same faces again. Thank you very much for coming to these lectures.